The moment Wilhelmina Winslow stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, her left boot heel snapped clean off and sent her stumbling straight into a mud puddle that swallowed her good traveling skirt up to the knee. And she looked down at the ruin of herself and laughed, because crying would have been far too easy, and Wilhelmina Winslow had never done anything the easy way in all of her 26 years on this earth. Caldwell was a cattle town sitting just north of the Cherokee Strip, a place where the Texas Longhorns came up the Kishom Trail and men drank themselves sensible and sometimes senseless in equal measure. It smelled of cattle and sawdust and ambition, and the main street was wide enough to turn a wagon around in without much trouble, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried their best to look more permanent than they were. There was a general store, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a post office that doubled as the telegraph station, a small church that had been built before the saloons but had never quite managed to outpace them in attendance, and a newspaper office with a hand-painted sign that read the Caldwell Courier in chipped black letters. That newspaper office was the reason Wilhelmina was standing in the mud. She had been hired by telegram from her previous position in Wichita, where she had spent 3 years working as a typesetter and occasional reporter for the Wichita Eagle, under the supervision of a reasonable man named Mr. Hartley, who had written her an excellent letter of recommendation before his paper had folded due to a combination of poor financial management and a circulation rivalry that had gotten entirely out of hand. The Caldwell Courier's owner, a man named Edgar Potts, had advertised for someone who could write, typeset, and manage the office without fainting at the sight of a cattle drive or a fistfight. Wilhelmina had written back that she had never fainted in her life and intended to keep that record intact. He had hired her within the week. She pulled her boot from the mud with a sucking sound that was deeply undignified, hoisted her traveling bag over one shoulder and her smaller case of personal items over the other, and walked on her uneven heels toward the newspaper office with the particular kind of determination that belongs to women who have already lost everything once and decided it was actually very clarifying. Wilhelmina had lost her family's farm in Missouri to a combination of drought and bad debt when she was 19. Her father had died that same winter, not dramatically but quietly, which had somehow been worse. Her mother had gone to live with her sister in St. Louis, and Wilhelmina had gone the other direction entirely, west and further west, because she had never been able to stop moving once she started, and because she believed in some deep private part of herself that she was looking for something, though she could not have named it on a bet. She did not believe in luck. She had watched too many people lean on it, wait for it, blame its absence for their troubles. Luck was a story people told themselves when they did not want to take responsibility for their choices or their circumstances. She believed in work. She believed in showing up. She believed in the particular dignity of doing a thing even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because that was the only kind of doing that actually amounted to anything. Edgar Potts was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a magnificent mustache that seemed to belong to someone with a great deal more confidence than he actually possessed. He met her at the door of the Courier office with the expression of a man who had been expecting someone else. "Miss Winslow," he said, looking at her mud-soaked skirt and her lopsided boots. "Mr. Potts," she said. "The Stagecoach Road needs grading, and the drainage on this street is a genuine civic embarrassment. I'd like to write a piece about it for the first edition I work on. Now, may I see the press?" Edgar Potts blinked at her twice and then stepped aside, and that was really the beginning of everything. She settled into Caldwell with the efficiency she brought to most things, finding a room to board with a widow named Mrs. Clara Hennessy, who lived 2 streets back from the main road and ran a clean, quiet house with an excellent garden and a strict policy against gentlemen callers after 8 in the evening, which suited Wilhelmina perfectly. She had no gentlemen callers to speak of. She had work, and she had books, and she had the long Kansas evenings that turned the sky every shade of copper and rose before the dark came down like a curtain on a stage. She wrote about the cattle drives. She wrote about the homesteaders filing claims on the surrounding land, about the particular tension between the ranchers who wanted open range and the farmers who wanted fences. She wrote about the Cherokee Strip and the complicated, painful politics of land that had been promised and taken and promised again in cycles that made her feel tired and angry in equal measure. She was not afraid to write about those things, even when Edgar Potts tugged at his magnificent mustache and suggested that perhaps a lighter tone might be more commercially viable. She told him that accuracy was more commercially viable in the long run, and he eventually stopped arguing, mostly because her pieces sold more copies than anything else in the paper. It was 3 weeks after her arrival in Caldwell that she first encountered Micah Sullivan, though encountered is perhaps too grand a word for what actually happened, which was that he walked into the newspaper office on a Tuesday morning in May and asked for 50 copies of the previous week's edition because his employer, a cattle rancher named Douglas Holt, wanted to send them to business associates in Kansas City, and would that be possible, and how much would it cost? Micah Sullivan was 29 years old and had the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and honest work into something that was not conventionally handsome, but was deeply, completely interesting. He was tall and lean in the way of men who spend most of their time in the saddle, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, which was clean but not new. His eyes were a warm, steady gray, the color of the sky just after a storm has passed and before the clouds have quite decided to leave. He wore his hat with the brim pulled down against the morning sun, and he held it in his hands when he stepped inside the way a man does when he has been raised to show respect in the presence of a lady or a business. Wilhelmina was in the back setting type, and she called out that someone would be with him in a moment, and when she came out wiping her ink-stained hands on her work apron, she found him standing at the counter reading the piece she had written about the drainage problem on Main Street, his lips moving slightly as he read, not because he was a slow reader, but because, she would later discover, he always read things twice and moved his lips the second time through when he wanted to make sure he had them right. 50 copies, she said. That will be $2.50. I can have them ready by Thursday afternoon. He looked up from the paper and the gray eyes were direct and entirely unpretentious. You write this? He asked, nodding toward the drainage piece. I did. It's good, he said. Specific. Most people complain about a thing without saying exactly what ought to be done about it. You said exactly what ought to be done about it. She had proposed 3 specific improvements to the drainage infrastructure of Caldwell's Main Street, with approximate costs derived from conversations with the town's most recent building contractor. She had also named the 2 town council members whose properties would benefit most from the improvements and who had so far blocked the expenditure, which had caused considerable social discomfort and which she considered entirely worth it. Thank you, she said, which was not something she said often enough about her work, and she knew it. He paid a deposit on the 50 copies, gave his name as Micah Sullivan, and told her he worked for the Holt Ranch about 6 miles east of town, and he tipped his hat and left. And Wilhelmina went back to her typesetting and thought about his eyes for approximately 4 minutes before firmly redirecting her attention to the matter at hand. She was not a woman given to romantic distraction. She had come close, once in Wichita, with a man named Robert Caldwell who had fine manners and a fine future, and who had ultimately wanted a woman who would transform herself into a particular kind of wife, the way you might transform a piece of rough lumber into finished furniture, sanding away everything interesting, until it was smooth and useful and completely stripped of its original character. She had declined that transformation with considerable firmness, and had occasionally wondered since whether she had been right to decline it, not because she had any doubt about Robert Caldwell specifically, but because the wondering was a natural human thing and she was, whatever else she might be, entirely human. She was not the kind of person who believed that romance would arrive like a gift wrapped in ribbon, delivered by fate or luck or some benevolent cosmic arrangement. She believed that most worthwhile things arrived because you worked for them and paid attention, and did not stop when things became difficult. She was not sure that applied to love exactly, but she had not yet been proven wrong by evidence to the contrary. Micah Sullivan came back on Thursday afternoon to collect the 50 copies, and he had with him a man she recognized from around town, a younger fellow named Pete Garfield who worked with him at the Holt Ranch and who had the cheerful, uncomplicated energy of a dog on a good day. Pete immediately began chatting with Edgar Potts about the cattle drive that was coming through next week, and Micah brought the copies to the counter and counted them with the methodical attention of someone who does not shortchange himself or others. "A piece about the drainage," he said without looking up from the counting. "The council met yesterday. They voted to approve the first of your 3 recommendations." Wilhelmina felt the small, precise satisfaction of that like a coin dropping into a cup. "Only the first. Councilman Briggs still has objections to the second. Councilman Briggs owns the land adjacent to where the second channel would need to run." Micah looked up then, and there was something in the gray eyes that was very close to amusement. "I noticed that too. I intend to mention it in the follow-up piece I'm writing this week." "I expect you do," he said, and there was no reproach in it, only a kind of quiet respect that was more interesting to her than flattery would have been. He came back the following week for no particular professional reason, which they both knew and neither acknowledged. He stopped by on a Wednesday morning, having ridden in from the Holt Ranch to pick up supplies for the bunkhouse, or so he said, and the post office happened to be next door to the newspaper office, and he happened to come in and say good morning, and ask whether she had heard that the council had reversed Briggs's objection on the second drainage channel. She had not yet heard it, and the pure satisfaction she felt made her set down her coffee cup and actually smile at him, which was not something she did carelessly. "What changed Briggs's mind?" she asked. "Your follow-up piece," he said. "3 different people stopped him on the street the day after it ran. I heard it was an uncomfortable morning for him." "Good," she said, with the precise emphasis of someone who means exactly that word and nothing softer. He smiled then, a real one, not the polite kind but the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth, and she thought that was a very fine thing to see, and then thought that she was being foolish, and then decided that perhaps she was allowed to notice a very fine smile without immediately prosecuting herself for it. He asked if he could buy her a coffee at Whitfield's, which was the better of the 2 eating establishments in Caldwell, a clean place run by a man named George Whitfield, who had come out from Ohio with his wife and 3 children, and who made an excellent beef stew and a passable apple pie. She almost said no out of habit, because she was busy, and because saying yes to things had a way of leading to other things, but she looked at the ink on her hands, and the work piled on her desk and thought, for once in her measured life, that she might allow herself an hour. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and drank their coffee, and talked about the cattle drives and the homesteading question, and the political situation with the Cherokee Nation, and the land policies coming out of Washington. And she discovered that Micah Sullivan had opinions that were specific and considered and occasionally surprising. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 17, he told her, with his older brother James, who had died of a fever 4 years later and whom he still missed in the way you miss a part of your own self that simply is not there anymore. He had cowboyed all over the territory since then, working cattle drives up the Kishom Trail twice before settling at the Holt Ranch 2 years ago, which he was saving toward leaving. "Leaving for what?" she asked. "Land," he said. "There's a piece of ground about 15 miles south, runs along a creek, has a good well already dug. I've been putting money aside since I came to Holt's. Another season, maybe 2. You want a ranch for yourself." "I want to build something for myself," he said, and there was a careful distinction in that she understood immediately and completely. She told him about Missouri and the farm and her father and moving west, and he listened the way very few people listen, without filling in the silences or preparing his next comment while she was still speaking. He listened as though what she was saying was the most important information he had received all week, which was disarming in a way she had not prepared for. "You don't talk about luck," he observed at one point, and she looked at him with narrowed eyes. "I don't believe in it," she said. He nodded slowly, as though this was not surprising to him. "Neither do I," he said. "I believe in showing up." And something in her chest did a thing that she would have called unreasonable if someone else had reported it to her, but which she acknowledged, privately and without drama, as the particular sensation of recognizing something true. She went back to work that afternoon and wrote 1,200 words on the upcoming cattle drive season with an efficiency that surprised even herself. The weeks that followed were the particular sweetness of something growing. He stopped by the newspaper office 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a practical errand and sometimes without one. He brought her a copy of a novel she mentioned she had been trying to find, a battered but complete copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that he had tracked down at a second-hand bookshop in the next town over. She held it and looked at him, and could not immediately find appropriate words, which was a new experience for a woman who had made her livelihood out of finding words. She went out to the Holt Ranch once in June to do a piece on the cattle drive operations for the Courier, and Micah showed her around the operation with the particular competence of someone who knows his work thoroughly and takes quiet pride in knowing it. Douglas Holt was a large, sunburned man in his 50s with a direct manner and a successful operation that ran several hundred head of cattle, and he treated Wilhelmina with the courtesy he would have shown any professional visitor, which she appreciated. She saw how Micah moved through the work, how the other hands respected him, how he spoke to the horses with a patience that was not performance but simply the way he was. She wrote a strong piece about the cattle drive that ran in the Courier's biggest edition of the season and was picked up and reprinted by a paper in Wichita, which pleased Edgar Potts enough that he gave her a modest raise without being asked, which was the most professionally significant thing that had happened to her since her arrival. Micah came in after the piece ran and brought her a jar of honey from a farm down the road because he had remembered, from a conversation 3 weeks earlier, that she had said she missed the taste of good honey and could not find any in town. She stood there holding the jar and realized that she was in considerable trouble because she could feel herself being thoroughly known, not in the way that strips a person down to something manageable and small, but in the way that sees you fully and finds you interesting, which is a rarer and more dangerous kind of being known entirely. She told him about Robert Caldwell in Wichita. Not all of it, but enough. They were sitting on the front steps of the newspaper office in the late afternoon, the light going honey-colored over the rooftops, and she told him that she had turned down a very practical future with a very reasonable man because she had not been willing to become something different from what she was. "Were you right to?" he asked, not rhetorically. "Yes," she said, and then because she was honest, "I think so, I've wondered sometimes." "Wondering is just thinking," he said. "It doesn't mean you were wrong." "What would you have done?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He did not rush to an answer to make her feel better. "I would have done the same thing," he said finally. "I've had chances that required me to be less than I am to take them. I didn't take them." "What did that cost you?" He looked out at the street where the late afternoon cattle were being driven through, raising a fine golden dust. "Some time," he said, "but time spent being yourself is not really time wasted." She looked at the side of his face in the gold light, and thought that she had never been given a piece of wisdom that felt more precisely tailored to the shape of her life. And she also thought that she was in a great deal more trouble than she had initially estimated. The real trouble arrived in July, though it wore the face of professional crisis rather than anything romantic, which was perhaps appropriate given the kind of story this was becoming. A man came to Caldwell named Arden Fitch, who represented a newspaper publishing interest out of St. Louis that was buying up small regional papers along the cattle routes. He was a polished man with city manners and a letter of credit from a bank with an impressive address, and he met with Edgar Potts behind the closed door of the Courier's back office for the better part of a morning. When Edgar Potts came out, his magnificent mustache was drooping at the ends in a way that said clearly that something uncomfortable had occurred. Edgar called Wilhelmina into the back office that afternoon and told her, with the expression of a man apologizing for a thing that was entirely his fault, that he had accepted an offer for the Courier, and that the new ownership intended to make several changes to the paper's character and direction, beginning with a reduced focus on what Arden Fitch had described as contentious political material, and an increased focus on commercial announcements and social reporting. By which he meant that the pieces Wilhelmina wrote about drainage councils and land policy, and the injustices being visited on the native peoples of the surrounding territory, were precisely the kind of thing the new ownership did not want. Wilhelmina sat very still and listened to all of this, and then asked Edgar how much time she had. Edgar looked at his hands. Mr. Fitch wants to take over editorial direction by the 1st of September. That was 6 weeks away. She thanked Edgar for telling her personally, and went back to her typesetting table and set type for 2 hours without saying another word, because she needed the mechanical repetition of it to organize her thoughts into something useful rather than merely furious. She was furious. She was also pragmatic, and the pragmatism was useful in a way that fury alone was not. The Courier was the only paper in Caldwell. If the Courier was going to become something other than what it had been under Edgar's imperfect but honest stewardship, then either she found another position or she made another option exist. She was sitting with this problem that evening in Mrs. Hennessy's garden, the fireflies just beginning their intermittent signaling in the long grass at the garden's edge, when Micah came by. He sometimes did in the evenings, had got into the habit of it the way that people get into the habit of things they need without quite naming the need. He would come and sit on the garden bench, and they would talk until the 8 o'clock rule required him to leave, and she had come to regard those evenings as the best part of her day, which was information she was still in the process of deciding what to do with. She told him about Arden Fitch and the Courier. She told it plainly, without drama, just the facts arranged in order, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than the way that meant he had nothing to say. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to keep writing the kind of work I write," she said. "I want to keep writing about what actually matters in this town, not just what's comfortable. Can you do that somewhere else?" "There is nowhere else in Caldwell." He was quiet again. "Then, what would it take to start your own paper?" She looked at him. "That's not a casual question." "I know it isn't." She had thought about it. She had thought about it in the way you think about things that are just at the edge of possible, close enough to see but far enough to be daunting. A small press could be acquired second-hand. She had typesetting skills that were, without false modesty, excellent. She knew the town, and the town knew her work. She had a small amount of savings, not enough but a foundation. The press alone would be the problem, she said. "A decent flatbed press is $200, maybe more second-hand. I have 60. He nodded slowly. He looked at the fireflies for a moment, and then he said, "I have 140 saved toward the land. The land piece won't be ready for another season at minimum anyway." She stared at him. "Micah, I'm not giving it to you," he said, immediately and firmly, and there was something in the firmness that was deeply reassuring rather than anything else. "I'm proposing a loan at fair interest, to be repaid within 2 years from the profits of the enterprise, assuming the enterprise is profitable, which I believe it will be because I have read everything you have written and I know what good work looks like. You would lend me your land savings." "I would lend them to a business I believe in," he said, and the gray eyes were steady and clear as the sky after rain. "And to a person I believe in." She was quiet for a very long time, long enough that the fireflies multiplied and the last light faded from the western sky, and Mrs. Hennessy's lamp came on in the kitchen window. She was quiet because she was doing two things simultaneously, which was deciding whether to accept the offer and deciding what it meant that he had made it, and both calculations required care. She said, "I need to think about this." "Of course," he said, as though there had been no doubt that she would. She thought about it for 3 days, during which she also had 3 conversations with Edgar Potts about press equipment suppliers he had dealt with previously, consulted the town's one lawyer about what was required to establish a business in Caldwell, and wrote a careful letter to a printing supply house in Kansas City asking for a catalog and current prices. She was doing her due diligence on the proposal before she answered it, because that was how she did things, and she also knew that he understood that was how she did things, which was itself part of why she was going to say yes. She found him at Whitfield's on a Saturday morning and sat down across from him and said, "I accept your terms, and I want to add a term of my own. I want the loan recorded formally with the lawyer in writing so that there is no ambiguity and no question of obligation that is anything other than professional." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you worried about the appearance of it?" "I'm worried about the reality of it," she said. "I will not take money from you as anything other than a business arrangement. If it is a business arrangement, it should be documented as one." "Agreed," he said, without any hesitation, and that was exactly the right answer, and she knew it. They went to the lawyer the following Monday and had the agreement drawn up, a straightforward promissory note at 5% annual interest with a repayment schedule of no more than 2 years. It was signed by both of them and witnessed by the lawyer's clerk and filed properly. Micah put his $140 in the bank in Wilhelmina's account the following day, and she immediately wrote to the printing supply house in Kansas City and began the process of acquiring a second-hand flatbed press that the supply house's agent had already identified as available from a paper in Abilene that was upgrading its equipment. She gave Edgar Potts her notice the same week, politely and with genuine warmth for the man who had hired her, and she told him what she intended to do, and Edgar looked at her with the expression of someone watching a river change course, and knowing that the old bed is simply going to have to dry up. She called her paper the Caldwell Independent. The press arrived in August, hauled down from Abilene on a freight wagon, and Micah was there when it came, along with Pete Garfield and 2 other fellows from the Holt Ranch who had come into town for the day, and found themselves recruited into the project of unloading and installing a 400-pound piece of printing equipment into the small storefront she had rented 2 doors down from the old courier office. The installation took most of the day and was an exercise in combined problem-solving that left everyone sweaty and slightly exasperated but ultimately triumphant. And when the press stood in its place and Wilhelmina ran her hand along the frame of it and felt the solid weight of the thing, she felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost dizzying. Micah stood beside her looking at the press, and she turned to him and said, without quite planning to, "Thank you. You did this," he said. "Not without your help." "Everybody needs someone to show up," he said simply, and it was not a complicated thing to say, but it landed in her chest like a stone landing in still water, spreading outward in every direction at once. She published the first edition of the Caldwell Independent on the 1st of September, the same day Arden Fitch formally took over the Courier. She had worked on it for 3 weeks, setting every line of type herself, writing 6 of the 7 pieces herself, and soliciting the 7th from a homesteader east of town who had an interesting account of his first season on the land. The front page carried a straightforward statement of purpose, which said that the Independent would report on the affairs of Caldwell and the surrounding territory with accuracy and without regard for whose comfort the reporting might affect, and that it welcomed correspondence from all quarters of the community, including those whose voices were not typically represented in the regional press. The first edition sold out by noon. She had printed 200 copies, which she had thought was ambitious. She printed another 100 by the end of the afternoon and sold those too. By the following week, when she published the second edition, she had taken out advertising from Whitfield's restaurant, the general store, and 2 of the cattle operations in the area, because advertising follows readers and she now had readers. Arden Fitch came to see her after the second edition ran. He was polite but pointed, suggesting that the region probably did not need 2 newspapers, and that his firm would be willing to make her an offer for her equipment and her subscription list if she wished to simplify her situation. She listened to everything he said with the patience she had learned over years of dealing with men who assumed that reasonable language was the same thing as a compelling argument. And then she told him that she appreciated his firm's interest, but that she had no plans to sell, and that competition was, after all, the foundation of the free market, which she understood was a principle his firm's principles held dear. He left in a manner that was still technically polite, but only barely. Micah heard about the visit that same afternoon, the way news moved in Caldwell, which was rapidly. He came by the office and she told him what Fitch had said and what she had said in return, and he listened and then he grinned, the full one that started in the eyes, and said, "I would have liked to see his face." "It was instructive," she said, and she was smiling too, and there was a moment where they were just standing in the new office with the smell of ink and newsprint and fresh lumber around them, grinning at each other like 2 people who were considerably happier than either of them had quite officially admitted to being. She almost said something then. She was not sure what she would have said, but something was pressing against the inside of her chest looking for a way out, and she was saved from having to decide whether to let it out by Pete Garfield appearing in the doorway with a question about whether either of them had seen his horse, which was an interruption so perfectly timed and so entirely Pete that she almost laughed out loud. The thing she had almost said kept its position inside her chest and waited, the way things you have not yet admitted do. September turned to October, and the weather began its serious decline from the easy warmth of late summer toward the sharp, brilliant cold of a Kansas fall. The cattle drives were winding down for the season, and the town shifted to its quieter winter character, and Wilhelmina was deep in the work of establishing the Independent as a permanent fixture of Caldwell's civic life. She was writing and typesetting, and managing the business and corresponding with subscribers and soliciting advertising, and doing all of it with the practical efficiency that was her fundamental way of being in the world. And she was also writing letters to the territorial newspapers about land rights, and to the federal Indian agent's office about the conditions in the surrounding territory, because the work of documentation does not stop because the season changes. She and Micah had fallen into a rhythm that was, she recognized, the rhythm of 2 people who have become necessary to each other without making a formal announcement of it. He came by the office most mornings when he was in town. They had supper together at Whitfield's once a week, which had become such a consistent arrangement that George Whitfield simply reserved the corner table for them on Thursday evenings without being asked. They walked sometimes, along the edge of town where the prairie opened up and the sky went on forever in every direction, and they talked about everything, books and the political situation, and the injustices being done to the Kiowa, and the Comanche on the reservations to the south, and what Micah was going to do when he had enough saved for his land, and what Wilhelmina was going to do with the Independent as it grew. And these conversations had the quality of 2 people building something together with words, laying out the architecture of a shared understanding. She was in love with him. She had known this with certainty for approximately 6 weeks and had not done anything about it because she did not know how to do something about it without making everything different, and what they had was already very good, and she was afraid in the particular way of people who have already lost things they valued and know exactly how much it costs. He was in love with her. She was nearly certain of this. The evidence was considerable, Not dramatic but consistent. The way he listened to her. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking. The way he had lent her his land savings with a directness that went beyond professional confidence in an investment and into something that had no name in any transaction she had ever been party to. But she was not entirely certain, because he was a contained man and she was not going to assume, and so she held her certainty and her uncertainty together and did nothing with either of them. The thing that broke the impasse was not romantic, or at least it did not begin romantically. In late October, Wilhelmina received information from a homesteader named Frank Bowman that a cattle company operating south of town had been illegally fencing range land that bordered a parcel filed by a family named Redbird, who were of Cherokee descent and had proper title to the land, a title being systematically ignored by the fencing operation. She went out to verify the information herself, riding in a borrowed buggy with Frank Bowman as a guide, and confirmed everything he had told her with her own eyes, and came back and wrote the most pointed piece she had written since arriving in Caldwell. The cattle company in question had considerable resources and a lawyer in Kansas City, and the morning after the piece ran, that lawyer arrived in Caldwell with a letter threatening legal action for defamation against Wilhelmina personally and the Caldwell Independent as an enterprise. He delivered this letter to her office in person, in the presence of two associates whose function was clearly decorative rather than legal. She read the letter carefully. She was frightened, if she was honest with herself. Not of the threat precisely, but of what it meant, which was that she was a small paper with limited resources, and they were a large company with considerable resources, and legal threats were expensive to defend even when you were entirely in the right. She was thinking about this with her hands very still on the letter when Micah walked in. He saw her face, and then he saw the letter, and then he said, "Tell me." She told him. He read the letter himself slowly, the second time with his lips moving slightly. When he was done, he looked up and his eyes were very steady. "Is your piece accurate?" he asked. "Every word? Do you have documentation?" Frank Bowman's written account, which I have in my files, and my own written account of what I saw personally, which I made before I wrote the piece, and the Redbird family's land title, a copy of which they were good enough to provide me. He nodded. "Then you fight it. Micah, the legal costs alone could ruin the Independent." "I know," he said, and then, "the land money I have saved, the rest of it what I haven't lent you, I want you to use it for the legal defense if it comes to that." She stared at him. "That is your land, that is 2 years of your life saved up." "I know what it is," he said quietly. "The land will still be there, it always will be. The story you're telling, what's happening to the Redbird family, that's happening right now. If you stop writing it because of money and legal threats, it keeps happening and nobody writes it." She felt the thing in her chest pressing harder than it ever had against whatever was containing it. She felt the pressure of it in her throat and behind her eyes, not in a tearful way, but in the way of something that is too large for the space it is occupying. "Why?" she said. It was not a complete question, but he understood what she was asking. He looked at her for a long moment. The fall light was coming through the front window of the office, and it was landing on the side of his face the way light in October lands, golden and a little thin, honest about what it is. "Because I believe in what you do," he said, "and because I believe in you, in a way that has been keeping me company every day for 5 months, and that I have not said out loud because I wasn't sure you wanted to hear it." The silence that followed was the specific silence of something that has been true for a very long time and has finally been allowed to be said. "I want to hear it," she said. Her voice was steady. She had spent 26 years practicing steadiness, and she was grateful for it now. He came around the counter and he stood in front of her, and he was close enough that she could see the texture of his jacket and the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Wilhelmina," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. "Yes," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "In a complete way that does not leave much room for anything else, and I have been for some time, and I would like very much to know whether that is something you want me to be." She put her hands on either side of his face, which surprised her because she had not planned it, and she said, "It is exactly what I want you to be." He kissed her with a gentleness that was also entirely serious, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back with everything she was, and the autumn light came through the window and fell on them both, and the press stood solid in the corner, and outside Caldwell went about its ordinary business, without knowing that anything extraordinary had just occurred within the walls of the Independent's office. They were both, of their natures, people who did not make hasty decisions or declarations, and the love they had for each other was of the kind that had been built carefully over months of real acquaintance, and was therefore not fragile or provisional or dependent on ignorance. It was the kind of love that has seen the other person work through a difficult problem, argue a point they care about, be tired and a little short and still fundamentally themselves, and has loved them continuously throughout all of it. It was a solid thing, the kind of thing you can build a life on. He did not have to offer his land savings for her legal defense, as it turned out. The letter from the cattle company's lawyer was, as her own legal advice confirmed, considerably more intimidating than it was legally sound. The documentation she had was thorough, the Redbird family's title was genuine and properly registered, and the accounting of what had happened to their land was factual and verifiable. A strongly worded response from Caldwell's own lawyer, sent at a fee that Wilhelmina managed out of the paper's operating funds, resulted in a quiet withdrawal of the threat within the month. She ran a follow-up piece on the Redbird land dispute that was so widely read it prompted a response from the county land office, and by December the illegal fencing had been removed, and the Redbird family had a measure of acknowledgement, if not yet the complete restoration they deserved, which Wilhelmina continued to cover. She returned Micah's offered savings at once, formally and in writing, and told him to put it straight back toward his land. He accepted this with the same directness with which he had offered it, and that was that. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a serious one, the kind that the Kansas plains produce when they have decided to remind everyone that this landscape is not domesticated and does not intend to be. The temperatures dropped into ranges that made outdoor work a negotiation between necessity and survival, and the town pulled inward the way towns do in hard weather, neighbors becoming more immediately important to each other because distance became a genuine obstacle. Micah still came into town, more carefully and less frequently, but he came. She had told Mrs. Hennessy, who was the warmest and most sensible woman she had met in Caldwell, that she and Micah were keeping company, and Mrs. Hennessy had received this information with a warmth that was entirely genuine and a practical lack of surprise that suggested she had seen what was happening long before either of them officially acknowledged it. He came for Christmas, which was something she had not expected, and which meant more to her than she was quite prepared for. He brought her a book she had been hunting for, a proper edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which she had mentioned once in passing 3 months earlier as something she had always wanted to own but never quite managed to find. She held it and thought about what it meant that he had remembered and tracked it down and brought it to her on Christmas Day, and she said his name with a softness she did not use very often. They had Christmas dinner at Mrs. Hennessy's, the three of them and Mrs. Hennessy's niece who had come to stay for the winter, and it was the first Christmas in several years that Wilhelmina had not felt the particular ache of being entirely alone in a festive season, and she noted the absence of that ache with a gratitude that was very quiet and very complete. He asked her in January, not formally, not with a performance of it, because neither of them were people for performance. He asked her walking back from Whitfield's on a Thursday evening, the snow compressed and blue-gray in the cold dark, their breath making brief clouds in the frigid air. He said, "I have been thinking about what I want my life to look like." And she said, "Tell me." And he said that he wanted the land and a house built properly, and cattle to start, and work that was his own, and he wanted all of that with her if she was willing. And he wanted to be very clear that willing meant she wanted it too, and not just that she was willing to accept it, because he knew the difference and it mattered to him. She stopped walking. The cold was absolute around them, and the stars above the Kansas plain were the kind of brilliant that only comes in extreme cold, staggeringly many and close. "I want it too," she said. "All of it, including the land and the house, and the independent." "Including the independent," he agreed, as though there had never been any question. "A rancher's wife who runs a newspaper would be a remarkable thing." "You would be a remarkable rancher's wife's husband," she said, and he laughed, a real full laugh that went up into the cold air, and she thought she had never heard a more perfect sound. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," she said. He pulled her close and kissed her there in the cold street under the impossible stars, and she put her arms around him and felt the warmth of him through the winter coats, and thought that this was exactly what it felt like to arrive somewhere you had been going without knowing you were going there. They were married in March of 1880 in Caldwell's church, the one that had been built before the saloons but had never quite caught up. Reverend Mills performed the service. Mrs. Hennessy and Frank Bowman and the Redbird family were in attendance, along with Pete Garfield, and the men from the Holt Ranch and George Whitfield and his wife, and a gratifying number of Caldwell's population, because Wilhelmina Winslow had made herself known in this town through her work, and Micah Sullivan was known through his character, and people wanted to see this particular pairing formalized. Edgar Potts was there, his magnificent mustache restored to its full glory, having separated from the courier operation when Arden Fitch's changes became intolerable to him, and now contributing occasional pieces to the Independent as a freelance correspondent, an arrangement that suited both of them very well. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue, the color of the sky just before dark, and she had wildflowers from Mrs. Hennessy's forced bulbs in her hair, and she was not nervous because she did not feel nervous. She felt certain, which was the finest feeling she had ever had standing anywhere. He was waiting at the front of the church with his hat held carefully in both hands and his eyes on her from the moment she appeared in the doorway, and the look in those steady gray eyes was everything, every complicated and complete thing, and she walked toward him with the absolute confidence of someone who knows exactly where she is going. Reverend Mills said the words. They said the words back. Micah placed a plain band on her finger with a care that was characteristic of everything he did, and she placed one on his. And that was that. They were married, Micah and Wilhelmina Sullivan, though she kept Winslow as her professional name for the paper because she had built a readership under it, and names matter in journalism, and he understood this without requiring an explanation. They moved into the house he had been renting at the edge of town, while they arranged the land question, which resolved itself in May of 1880 when Micah's savings, rebuilt over the winter with the particular intensity of a man with a clear purpose, reached the amount required to purchase the 15-Mile Creek parcel he had been watching for 3 years. He came home on the evening the purchase was finalized with the look of a man who cannot quite contain what he is feeling, and she was at the kitchen table going over the Independence accounts when he came through the door, and she looked up and saw his face and put the accounts down immediately. "It's done," he said. She crossed the room and embraced him and felt him breathe, a long breath, the kind that lets go of something that has been held for a very long time. "Let's go see it tomorrow," she said into his shoulder. They rode out the next morning, both of them on horseback because the buggy was impractical on the creek road, and she saw the land for the first time with him there beside her to show her what he saw in it, which was everything. The way the creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones, the stands of cottonwood trees along the bank that would provide shade in summer, the long open grassland that rolled toward the horizon with the patient endlessness that was the particular beauty of the Kansas plains, which was not a dramatic beauty but a true one. There was the well he had mentioned, properly dug and properly lined, and a small existing structure, more shed than house, that had been there when the previous owner had abandoned the claim, which would serve as storage while they built. She stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water running over the stones and felt the spring sun on her face and thought about the farm in Missouri, the one she had lost, the one she had grieved, and she thought that grief is also sometimes a kind of navigation, pointing you toward what you needed to find. "It's beautiful," she said. "We'll build the house there," he said, pointing to a rise above the creek that would catch the morning light and have a view of both the water and the grassland. "Good foundation ground. I had a man look at it." "Practical," she said. "Always," he said, and the smile was the real one, the eyes first and then the mouth. They began building in the summer of 1880. Micah hired 2 men who knew construction and worked alongside them through the long summer days. And Wilhelmina came out on weekends when she was not at the paper, and sometimes during the week to see the progress. And the house took shape over the course of 3 months, with the satisfying inevitability of a thing that was meant to exist. It was not grand, but it was solid. 2 stories of good timber framing with a proper stone foundation, and a wide front porch that faced east toward the morning light, and a kitchen that Wilhelmina had specific opinions about, which Micah had incorporated into the plans with the practical respect he gave all of her opinions. They moved out to the ranch in October, 1 year after the conversation about the courier and Arden Fitch and the loan that had changed everything between them, and she stood on the front porch of the new house on the first morning and watched the sun come up over the creek and the grass and felt the profound satisfaction of something fully built. She drove into Caldwell 3 days a week for the Independent, which she continued to operate with the same exactness she had always brought to it. She had hired a young woman named Alice Marsh as a typesetter and general assistant, Alice being 17, and showing such clear aptitude for the work that Wilhelmina had hired her despite her age, and arranged for her to complete her education by correspondence while working part-time, which Alice's mother had been deeply grateful for, and which Wilhelmina considered simply the right thing to do, because she had not been given opportunities that someone recognized in her potential as a young woman, and she understood what that cost. The Independent continued to grow. It had subscribers in 4 counties by the end of 1880. It was reprinted regularly by larger papers in Wichita and occasionally in Kansas City. It was known as the paper that wrote the things that needed writing, and its editor was known as a woman who did not stop when the writing became inconvenient, which was the exact reputation Wilhelmina had set out to build. The promissory note between Micah and Wilhelmina was paid in full 13 months after its signing, with interest, because she kept her word in the way she kept everything, precisely and completely. She presented him with the paid note and the receipt of payment on a Sunday morning, and he took it and looked at it and said, "I never worried about it," and she said, "I know." "I did it anyway," and he said, "I know," and the smile was the full one, and she loved him so completely that it was simply the condition of her existence, as natural and fundamental as the way she breathed. Their son was born in February of 1882, during a blizzard that closed the road between the ranch and Caldwell, and necessitated a situation that was very different from what had been planned, which had involved getting Wilhelmina to the doctor in town well before the birth was imminent. The blizzard had other ideas, and so did the baby, and Micah was beside her for the whole of it with the calm, steady presence that she had come to understand was simply who he was when things were hardest, more himself, not less. Mrs. Hennessy had come to stay 2 weeks before, anticipating exactly this kind of contingency because she was a practical woman, and she managed the delivery with a competence that settled the situation considerably. They named him James, for Micah's brother who had died of fever in Tennessee, the part of himself that was simply missing. Micah held the baby and looked at the name written in the record, and the gray eyes were very full, and he did not say anything for a moment, only looked, And Wilhelmina watched his face and felt something so deep and quiet move through her that she had no word for it in any language she knew. James Sullivan grew into the particular small person that all babies become when they are given enough food and warmth and attention, which is to say, he grew into his own self with his own opinions and his own ways. And he was from the very beginning interested in everything, pulling himself toward every new thing with the absolute confidence of someone who does not yet know that the world contains anything to be afraid of. The Caldwell Independent, in the spring of 1882, ran a series of pieces about land rights and treaty violations in the surrounding territory that attracted the attention of a Washington correspondent who was traveling through Kansas gathering material for a broader national peace. He came to the Independent's office and sat with Wilhelmina for 3 hours, and when he left he told her that her coverage of the issue was the most thorough and accurate regional reporting he had seen on the subject, which she received with the practical satisfaction she received all professional recognition, noting it and returning to work. The Courier, under Arden Fitch's ownership, had steadily diminished. Fitch's commercial focus had alienated the readership that Edgar Potts had built, and by 1882 it was running on a skeleton schedule and had lost most of its advertising to the Independent. This was not something Wilhelmina took pleasure in as a personal triumph, but she did note it as evidence of the principle she had always held, which was that accurate, serious reporting creates trust and trust creates readership, and that no amount of commercial appeal can substitute for the fundamental thing. Fitch himself left Caldwell in the spring of 1882, selling the Courier's remaining equipment at a considerable loss to a man who intended to use the press for commercial printing, which was a perfectly respectable use. Wilhelmina absorbed the Courier's remaining subscriber list into the Independent, and Edgar Potts, who was by now contributing 3 pieces a week as the Independent's senior correspondent and had found in this role a professional fulfillment he had never quite achieved as an owner, stood in the office and said, "I should have been working for you from the start," and she said, "You would have driven me mad." We needed the time, which was true. The ranch grew steadily. Micah had a practical relationship with growth, not rushing it but not hesitating when opportunity was clear. By 1883, they had 100 head of cattle and 2 horses that were so well trained they were being sought out by neighboring ranchers as working stock. He had hired 2 permanent hands, a quiet older man named Ezra who had been cowboying since before the war and who knew cattle the way some people know music, deeply and instinctively, and a young Mexican man named Raphael who had come up from Texas and who was, after Micah himself, the best horseman Wilhelmina had ever watched work. She had been nervous briefly about how the cattle business would affect the stories she told in the paper, whether she would find herself unable to write critically about an industry she was personally invested in. She had told Micah about this concern directly, which was how she handled most concerns, and he had said, "Write what's true. If we do something that ought to be reported, report it. The ranch can take the scrutiny." And she had tested this not long after, when a new fencing practice popular among ranchers near them was causing problems for homesteaders' water access, and she wrote about it exactly as she saw it, including a reference to the fact that while the Sullivan Ranch did not use that particular practice, the broader industry trend was problematic, and Micah had read the piece and said, "Good," which was all she needed. Their daughter was born in 1884, on a spring evening with the windows open to the sound of the creek, under considerably more organized circumstances than James's arrival. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Hennessy, who had been at the ranch for the occasion and who cried with a warmth that was entirely characteristic of her, and who held the baby and looked at Wilhelmina and said, "You two are very good at this," meaning not just the baby but the whole of it, the life they were building, and Wilhelmina thought that was perhaps the finest compliment she had ever received. James, who was 2 1/2 and had his father's gray eyes and his mother's opinions, regarded his new sister with an initial suspicion that softened into a proprietary affection over the course of approximately 2 weeks, after which he appointed himself her primary protector and educational resource, which Clara would spend her entire childhood alternately appreciating and resisting. Micah was the kind of father that Wilhelmina had somehow known, from some early deep instinct, that he would be. Patient in the specific way of someone who has thought about how to be patient rather than someone who is simply passive, engaged rather than merely present, curious about his children as people rather than just responsible for them as dependents. She watched him with James, explaining the workings of a bridle with the same thoroughness he would bring to explaining it to an adult, and with Clara, holding her with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, and she felt the particular warmth of being in a life that was good all the way through, not just on the surface but in its actual substance. She continued to write. She never stopped writing. She wrote about the changes coming to Kansas with the railroads and the closing of the open range. She wrote about the homestead community and its challenges and its successes. She wrote, carefully and with as much documentation as she could gather, about the ongoing dispossession of native peoples from the lands surrounding Caldwell, a subject that was uncomfortable for many of her readers, and that she considered essential precisely because it was uncomfortable. She knew that the stories she was not telling were the ones that would be missed the most, and she was not interested in a comfortable silence. There was a letter, in the summer of 1884, from a publisher in St. Louis, not the company that had bought the Courier but a legitimate book publisher, asking whether she would be interested in compiling a selection of her pieces on the land and treaty question into a book format. She sat with the letter for a long time, and then she went and found Micah, who was in the barn with Ezra doing something complicated involving a piece of harness equipment, and she read him the letter. He listened and then he said, obviously yes, with a directness that suggested he considered this conclusion self-evident, and she laughed and said she would write back. The book was published in 1886 under the title Land and Record, Dispatches from the Kansas Frontier, by Wilhelmina Winslow. It was reviewed in 7 papers and was adopted by a normal school in Kansas City as supplementary reading material for students studying Western territorial history. She received a modest advance and considerably more in subsequent royalties, which she invested in the Independence equipment. The night she received the first copies from the publisher, Micah sat across from her at the kitchen table and turned the book over in his hands and read the spine, and then he opened it and read the first page, which began with a sentence she had written about standing in a mud puddle on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, and deciding to write about the drainage. He looked up from the page and his eyes were full of everything. "This is your life's work," he said. "Part of it," she said, and she looked at him, and then at the sound of James's voice from the next room and the picture of Clara sleeping in the cradle that was visible from where she sat, and he understood exactly what the rest of it was. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and that was a private thing between the two of them and the kitchen lamp and the sound of the creak outside the window. A moment so full of everything good that she held it in her memory for the rest of her life, and could call it back with the perfect fidelity of something that is too important to forget. Caldwell changed in the years that followed, as the Kansas cattle towns were all changing, the drives winding down as the railroads moved their heads of cattle in different ways, and the open range gave way to the fenced world of the homesteaders and the smaller independent ranchers. The Sullivan Ranch held its own in this changing landscape because Micah was practical and responsive, shifting their operation as the economics shifted, never so committed to one way of doing things that he could not adapt when adapting was clearly necessary. He was 37 in 1887, and at the full competence of himself, the lean efficiency of the cowboy years now filled out with the substance of a man who owns his land and knows his work, and has something to come home to that constitutes the actual point of everything. She was 34, and at the height of her professional authority. The Independent, now the most widely read paper in the county, and her name known as far as Kansas City in newspaper circles. They were two people who had built exactly what they meant to build, and knew it. She talked to him sometimes about the things that had brought her here, the farm she had lost, the father she had grieved, the years of moving west in search of something she had not been able to name. She could name it now. She told him one evening on the front porch while the children slept and the stars were out in the enormous Kansas sky. She could name it as the specific combination of work that was hers and love that was real and a place that was a true place, all of it together, none of it borrowed or modified to fit someone else's idea of what she should be. He listened, and when she was done he said, "You would have found your way here without me." "Probably," she agreed. And then, "But having you here is what makes here the right place." He looked at her in the dark with those steady gray eyes that she had been looking into for 8 years now, and that still had the capacity to make something in her chest do the thing it had done on the very first morning he smiled at her, the real smile, in the newspaper office over a drainage piece. "I am glad I showed up," he said. She thought about that word, showed up, the same words he had used that first afternoon at Whitfield's when she had said she did not believe in luck. "Neither do I," he had said. "I believe in showing up." And she had recognized something true in it with the precision of a bell struck at the right frequency, because it was her own belief stated in someone else's words, and that was a rare and particular kind of recognition. She thought about all the mornings he had shown up. The morning at the newspaper counter with his copy of her drainage piece and his direct gray eyes. The Wednesday mornings that were never quite accidental. The morning with the book of Middlemark. The morning the press arrived, and he was simply there to help move it, because he had known she would need help and had come. The morning of the legal threat when he had sat across from her and said he believed in what she did and in her, and meant both things entirely. The morning they went to see the land together, both on horseback, the creek running cold and clear below them. The morning James was born in the blizzard, and he was there, steady and calm, more himself than anyone she had ever known in a hard moment. He had shown up for everything. Not because he was lucky and not because she was, but because he had decided to be there, and he was the kind of man who did what he decided. And she was the kind of woman who had always known the difference between those two things and had been looking, without knowing she was looking, for exactly that. "I am glad you showed up too," she said. The creek ran on below the porch, and the stars were impossibly numerous above the Kansas plain, and somewhere in the house James murmured something in his sleep, and Clara made the small satisfied sounds of a baby entirely content with her circumstances. And the night was warm for October, and the smell of the prairie came up to them on a light wind. And Micah Sullivan and Wilhelmina Winslow Sullivan sat together on the porch of the house they had built on the land he had saved for. And that was everything. All of it, every piece of it complete, and in its right place. There is a photograph, taken in 1889 by a traveling photographer who came through Caldwell, with the new equipment that was making photographs possible in places they had never been possible before. The photograph shows them in front of the Independent's office on the main street of Caldwell, which still needed its drainage infrastructure improved, but had made considerable progress since 1879. Micah stands on the left with his hat in his hands, and his gray eyes steady toward the camera lens. Wilhelmina stands on the right with her hand in his and her chin up, and her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who knows exactly who she is and has made her peace with finding that knowledge sufficient. Between them and around them are James, 7 years old, and Clara, 5, who is blurred slightly at the edges because she was moving when the shutter opened, which is the most characteristic thing possible about Clara Sullivan at 5 years of age. The photograph shows a family that was built by two people who did not believe in luck, who believed in showing up, and who had spent 10 years proving between them that this belief was not just a philosophy but a practice, a daily decision, a choice made repeatedly in the small, and the large circumstances of a life, in mud puddles and blizzards and legal threats and harvests and births and mournings. The Independent ran until 1912, when Wilhelmina, 59 and still sharp as her best typesetting blade, handed editorial control to Alice Marsh, who had grown from a 17-year-old typesetter into a journalist of genuine ability, and who took the paper forward into the next century with the same principles it had always held. Wilhelmina remained as contributing editor for 5 more years and wrote a weekly column until she was 67, at which point she stopped writing for publication, because she found she had more interesting things to do, including a second book she was working on about the history of the Kansas Frontier Press, which she completed and published in 1920 at the age of 67 to generally warm reviews. Micah ran the ranch until James was old enough to take it on, which happened gradually in the way of all transitions that are done with care, James learning from his father with the same patience his father had brought to all teaching, and Micah stepping back from the heavier work without any drama about the stepping back, because he had never been a man who needed to hold onto things past their time. They grew old together in the house above the creek, the one built in the summer of 1880 with the wide porch facing east, the morning light faithful in the way. The best things in a life are faithful, showing up every day without drama or announcement, simply present and illuminating. James married a woman from Wichita named Sarah, a school teacher with a quick intelligence and a stubbornness that Wilhelmina recognized and entirely approved of, and they had 3 children who grew up on the Sullivan land, knowing the creek and the cattle and the smell of newsprint when their grandmother brought home the latest edition of the Independent, which she did until she stopped producing it, and then continued to bring when it was produced by Alice Marsh. Because she remained a reader even after she stopped being a writer, which she considered the correct order of priorities. Clara, who had always been moving when the shutter opened, became a surveyor, one of the first women to work in that profession in Kansas, which had required a fight that she waged with the particular combination of her mother's argumentative precision and her father's patient consistency, which was a formidable pairing in any dispute. She worked all over the territory and eventually the state, and came back to Caldwell regularly with the contained delight of someone who loves her origin without being defined by it. The thing that Wilhelmina had set out to find when she left Missouri at 19 with her father newly buried and the farm newly lost, that nameless thing that drove her west and further west until she walked off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with a broken boot heel, and landed in a mud puddle and laughed instead of crying, turned out to be exactly what she had always had inside her, the belief in work and showing up and the particular dignity of doing a thing honestly. She had found it in herself, and then found someone who had the same thing in him, and they had spent 40 years showing up for each other and for the work and for the wide, complicated, beautiful, unjust, magnificent world that constituted their lives on the Kansas frontier. She said once, in the column she wrote for the Independent's 40th anniversary edition, that she did not believe people were found by grace or luck or fate, that she believed they were found by themselves, slowly, through the accumulation of choices made in the direction of what they knew to be true, and that the other people who mattered in a life arrived because the same process was happening in them. 2 trajectories intersecting not by chance, but by the very particular logic of people becoming who they were going to be. Micah read the column at the kitchen table the morning it was printed, the same kitchen table they had shared for 40 years, the same morning light through the east window, the creak audible through the open door. He read it twice, the second time with his lips moving slightly. Then he folded the paper and looked at her across the table and said, "That's the best thing you've written." She looked at him. The gray eyes were older now and just as steady. She thought of the drainage piece and middle mark, and the jar of honey, and the legal threat, and the blizzard, and the porch, and the creek, and every morning of every year that he had simply been there, present and real and exactly himself. "I had good material," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and outside the Kansas morning was doing what it always did, enormous and unhurried and full of light, and the creek ran on below the porch just as it had on the first morning they had stood together above it in the spring of 1880, and she had said it was beautiful and he had said where he intended to build the house, and they had built it and lived in it, and filled it with everything worth having, one deliberate day at a time.